what thing could we even build that allows us to not have this incredible complexity? And the incredible complexity I'm referring to is the infrastructure side of things. So Dark was really how do we build without the user having to think about any of this stuff?
Hey, before we get started, we'd like to direct you towards our merch store. You get some cool devtools-fm merch, or even this TypeScript hoodie. Show how close to the metal you are with this one. If you're a member of our Patreon, you get a 20% discount code. Now let's get on to the episode. But remember, the full episode is only available to our Patreon members. Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey everyone, our guest today is Paul Biggar. Paul was the founder of CircleCI and spends his time these days working on Dark, an integrated development environment for building serverless backends. I'm sure that's not really doing Dark justice, so Paul, I'll let you describe that better. But before we dig into Dark, maybe you can tell us or tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm a developer basically. I've been a developer for about 20 years. I did a CS degree. I did a PhD in compilers and static analysis, and then I'd mostly done startups. So I started CircleCI. I was the CEO there for the first 4 years, and for kind of the first one of that, it's writing code, and the rest of it is not so much writing code. And then I've been working on Dark now for about 5 years, and that as of recently, as the last couple of years, it's been an awful lot of writing code and just working on making the product really good for users.
Let's start with CircleCI for a little bit because I personally have been a very avid CircleCI user.
Wonderful! Thank you.
When I was at Intuit, I was very gung-ho on trying to switch from Jenkins to CircleCI because the experience is just so much better. What prompted you to found CircleCI, and was it your first startup?
It was my third startup. The other two having just not gone anywhere, but the experience of having done them really, kind of stood with me, and so Circle was kind of my first startup that went anywhere, where that really got off the bottom rung of the ladder. Started it largely because I was working at Mozilla. I was an engineer on the JavaScript engine, and so all the time I'm using the tool that they had at the time, the what we would now call a CI server, and it kind of sucked. And so I kind of spent a year banging my head against this thing. Well, one thing in particular is that if something failed in the CI server and worked locally on your machine, there's nothing you could do. You could make a ticket, and then they might be able to get you access to the server in the next few days to sort of see what went wrong. And so one of the first things we did at Circle was we built the ability to retry a build with SSH enabled. So it's that sort of thing, just sort of like, the experience of using this thing is terrible. And I think we can make something better.
Yeah, absolutely. That retry with SSH feature was gold. I use that many times. Yeah,
people keep building CI competitors that don't have that. I'm like, what are you doing?
For sure. So you mentioned the first year of Circle was like a lot of programming, and then sort of you get after that and it's like less and less programming, more and more business stuff. So what's the experience like shifting from, this like developer hands-on, you're just the whole team is just getting together to build product, to this like higher level, you're now, executive board member, like out of the day-to-day product delivery. What's that transition like?
Well, I guess it's sort of the company transition, like the very early stage is fun, and with Circle it didn't last very long. It was maybe 6 months really before we started having a decent number of users, where there's an awful lot of user discovery, and literally 6 months after I wrote the first line of code, I was spending significant portions of the day just like calling up users and saying like, what went wrong? What can we fix? What can we improve? Will you give us money? That sort of thing. And then, the next 6 months after that, I largely did support. So I was answering every support email, and it was only then that we started to have a team. So that transition actually wasn't too bad. I really enjoyed the small team time. We maybe had a year of just kind of everyone sort of figuring out what to work on for themselves, and then that broke down around 9 people. And then between 9 and 25 people was when I was just in disarray. I just had no idea what to do, where to spend my time, all this sort of thing that you read about in startups about, like, setting the culture and setting the mission, and more obvious things like product roadmaps and management structures and that sort of thing. Just like, and part of the thing was we weren't really into some of that. There was a lot of like flat company stuff going on. Don't do it. Bad idea. But at the end of 4 years of that, I was just like, I don't like this job anymore. This being CEO of a 25, 30 person company where, the time that you're spending is like building this company. It's not a super fun job. I really enjoy coding. I really enjoy working on the product and making improvements to the product and things that are user facing. And, hiring the salespeople and drawing up a commission plan, do not like.
Yeah, for sure. So now that you're no longer at Circle, do you still use it?
Yeah, I use it like literally every day.
Awesome.
Nice.
Yeah.
So is Dark built upon CircleCI?
I mean, it's not built on it, but we have traditional code bases. We have a client and a server, and there's also a little bit of other stuff, but that's basically it. And so we have a mono repo, and we have a CI/CD pipeline for it, and there's 11 steps, and there's a deployment step as well, and the kind of things that you expect in a standard sort of webby SaaS kind of project.
Awesome. Yeah. That's awesome. So maybe we can switch over and start talking about Dark. Dark is a super exciting project. I've followed it for a while. So how would you describe Dark to someone who has never heard of it?
I'm assuming they're a coder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the first step is explaining what the cloud is. So the way I really like to think about Dark is getting rid of all the bullshit from backend development. I don't think that I approach it from the idea of like, oh, I've got this great idea for how software should be written. It really came from the idea that, why do we do all this bullshit? Why do we have to deal with all this shit? And surely there's a way of writing code that doesn't have it. And so it's really about like taking things away, and you described earlier, it's kind of an IDE for building cloud applications. So, it's not entirely wrong. But how we approach it is like, what thing could we even build that allows us to not have this incredible complexity? And the incredible complexity I'm referring to is the infrastructure side of things. So like, everything from spinning up more instances and kind of, the serverless side of things, to CI/CD pipelines, to database migrations, anything where kind of should be obvious and instant, and instead we've kind of built up this legacy, and whether that legacy is like containers or Unix or IDEs and syntax and then that sort of thing. It's like none of this stuff is actually a necessary part of coding. Like the only thing that really matters for coding is that you've got input, you've got output, you've got some computation that you want to do on it. Those are kind of the essential things. And we have this 50, 60 years of stuff that we've built up, layers that we keep adding stuff on top of. And so Dark was really a, how do we build without the user having to think about any of this stuff, the developer having to think about any of this stuff.
Yeah, that reminds me. So back in episode 26, we talked to the founder of, or the creator of arc.codes, which is a serverless sort of like framework. And we talked a lot about like incidental complexity and how more and more paradigms are evolving to sort of get us past that complexity and focus more directly on like what is the product we're building, not as what is all the stuff we have to duct tape together to even get to the point to build the product. So yeah, it's a super admirable goal, and I think highly needed.
Yeah, I think they're very much on that is arc.codes is on the same page as us as like, you know, we have to remove things from the like how developers think about what they're building, because there's a lot of people out there who are solving this by adding more things, and those are probably, you know, in many ways more practical. You know, they're solving the problem today, and I you know have a lot of love and affinity for the people who are doing this will not actually be really good for 5 years, but we managed to remove this, and this from it.
So, Darkling has this theme of like shedding the past and making a new way to develop your backend services. How does that differ from traditional methods? Like, what does writing a Dark application feel like?
Yeah. So I'll kind of talk about it from the way of, you know, that we're removing stuff. So one of the obvious things that we're removing is infrastructure. So when you set up a database in Dark, you just add the database. Like, you know, you click a button or you use the keyboard shortcut or whatever, and then the data stores there. And there was no, you know, there's no acquiring a server from somewhere to put it on. There's no, you know, going to, you know, some other service and, you know, inserting a URL for your Postgres config or whatever. The schemas are just, you know, specified in the same language as the rest of Dark, so there isn't SQL there. When you make a request or when you make a query, you query in the Dark language, which is the same as the rest of the language that you're using, and it's just like these functions are, you know, behind the scenes they're compiled down to the SQL that you would need, but in, you know, to the developer, it just looks like the same language, and the things that you pull out of it are again the same language. So there's no ORM, there's no impedance mismatch between the values that you store in the database and the values that you store in the language. Similarly, when you're setting up a HTTP request, you're not setting up a HTTP server, you just add an endpoint. And the endpoint is directly connected to the code, and you write them in the same place. So there's no spinning up servers. Yeah, I think there's a lot of serverless where there's no spinning up servers, but there's also like no API gateway. There's no, you know, it's just all kind of native. The values that come in are native, and they're in the Dark language as well. And then when you're writing code, you know, you want to remove the latency between when you write code in your computer and it going into production for your users. And so we said, you know, that time is going to be 0. There's not going to be any building containers. There's not going to be any like pre-deployment steps. It is just you write code and it's immediately in production. And you can, this one I think is one of the hardest ones, and it's still something that we continue to work on because you need that to be safe. So the language is designed in such a way that every key character you type can safely go into production without production just having a syntax error or the server shutting down. Or that, you know, there needs to be a way to write new code without breaking the old code. And so feature flags are baked into the language, they're baked into the editor, they're baked into the infrastructure. It's all kind of like designed around this 0 second. We've been calling that deployless. Someone coined that a couple of years ago. And that's kind of the word that we've been using for it. And it's just like, yeah, every keystroke goes straight in production. How can that be done safely? And so as a result, you have no you've no CI pipelines, you've no like extensive unit tests or integration tests that gets run. There's no deployment process like with Kubernetes or whatever. It's just sort of like, it's all built into this one environment, and it's all like cut down to the absolute minimum that it could possibly be.
Yeah, the structured editor of Dark was like one of the really exciting things that I saw in the beginning, because it's like that model I've wanted to take off in some way for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we deal a lot with like formatters and, have flame wars over like tabs versus spaces and, just all this stuff. And it's gotten better over the years, right? With like auto formatters and stuff. But I mean, still you can make mistakes, and it's like time wasted just,
Yeah.
typing characters.
I mean, there's quite a there's quite a lot to be said about kind of auto formatters and code formatters and kind of how they've made the world a little bit better. I think they, if you have a repo, you should have an auto formatter in it, which of course becomes more complexity that you need to set up. And then, you have the issue that some of your users have one version of the auto formatter, and then some have another version, or you need to migrate between versions of them, and there's a different formatting change. And so now there's something throughout the code base, or there's a code base wide diff that you need to apply to do this thing. And the people whose branches existed before that need to be rebased onto it. And so this is, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to evolve. Even very small things like code formatters bring in complexity. And I totally agree that the world is better with code formatters rather than without it. But even then, like, can you remove that complexity? Can you abstract over it? And one of the nice things, I meant to implement this a couple of weeks ago, since we now are at a place that we can do it. But why does every user have to indent the same level? Like some people like indent 2, some people like indent 4, some people like to line up the right hand sides of their records that they're using or something like that. Some people don't. These should be settings for users that they set, and making the setting shouldn't affect what it is for everyone else. And because we store code in text and we put that text in a Git repository, and every user has the same version of that Git repository, and this pulls down the same text, we don't really have any sort of like advanced stuff, and we still have to deal with kind of all this bullshit as a result.
Yep. So is there any sort of version control built in? So like I'm assuming it doesn't work with Git right now?
It does not work with Git, very, very much intentionally. Git, like many things, Git is wonderful, but also Git is very complex. And I'm not sure that the model that it brings to the world is super valuable. And I think that we do a lot better without it. So there is version control. Version control is done. Well, let me talk about what exists, because most of Dark is still speculative and still is sort of designed, but it's not done. So right now Dark is sort of a multiplayer canvas, and it has infinite undo. So you can undo any changes to the thing. Where we are going with this is that feature flags are essentially branches. So they are checkpoints that you can go back to view the old code. They provide the benefits of branches. So if you think of feature flags as a branch, right? You're building something in production, and so there isn't really this whole separate branch over here where at some point you're going to merge that branch over the main branch. That model doesn't really apply when you're building in production. Instead, what it feels more like is you have, kind of like an A/B test / feature flag sort of thing, where you're building your branch separately in this little box over here instead of that thing over there. And the language is designed to allow that with, version functions and that sort of thing. So a lot of the things that we assign to Git, long-running feature branches, diffing, history, reversion, they look different, but they will exist, or in some cases do. So I think reversion is a really good idea. Like it's not safe to just revert something, right? When you committed it the first time, you probably had like a safe rollout, but the world has changed since then. So like going backwards is something that you probably haven't tested. So if you want to revert something, you really have to put it like in a feature flag. And you know, if it's a hurry, you know, you can press the force this shit through from button and force it through. But really, you want to slowly roll out that thing to make sure that the reversion doesn't break anything as well. And you don't want to just like force push onto the main branch and force that deployment out and hope that those containers with that version of the application work well. It doesn't really make sense.
So I assume there's no environments also. Those are all just also done through this feature flagging system?
Yes. And I think one area that we havenent fully figured out is what to do with databases. Like, people like to have a staging version of the of their database or a local version of it. And that's something that we haven't quite figured out. But I think a lot of database vendors have versions of that work where you can take a snapshot, work on that. So the model isn't necessarily that typical. It's just sort of like, how does it fit in with all the rest of it?
Yeah, PlanetScale's approach to this is really interesting, where they actually has this really sophisticated schema versioning thing under the hood. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So we have plans around schema versioning for the data store, but that's sort of separate from we would like this data to not be corrupted by these changes that we're trying to make.
Yeah. Going back to removing some of the overhead and traditional applications. So Dark is a pretty visual environment that you're developing in. You're generally writing code in this. Does the canvas still exist in the new version of Dark, where you're like
the canvas still exists? It won't fully exist in the future version, or it will be a different sort of paradigm. But you will still be typing text.
Yeah, I think the really great thing about that is you're not focused on literal text file structure. You're focused on how to organize your project from like a hierarchical perspective. You're just thinking like, oh, I need an HTTP handler. I'm just going to create one right here. And it's like the organization, how that sort of frees you up from not having to like think about this like relational, like organizational stuff. I find just like makes the mental model of just developing an app so much easier.
Yeah, I mean, often you have something like, this directory is managed by this person, or this team, works on this repo, and this other team works on this repo, and this sort of idea where your, the structure of your application, in a certain sense, follows the structure of your team or your organization. And I think it makes a lot more sense to just accept that from the very start, and to design this application around it. So, so Dark has this concept. Again, this bit isn't built, but or at least we built a version of it, wasn't good, so it's been removed. We want people to group around this sort of organization. So groups represent teams, groups represent products, groups represent microservices, sort of, just like what I said with the everything kind of being in the same language. It's you want to use a single concept to represent multiple things. So you no longer need separate repos, separate directories, separate files. There's just one concept of separation. And you can use it in sort of nested in multiple ways and apply permissions at various different levels and that sort of thing to it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It's like, working with Conway's law instead of working against it.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny that we keep, how much files exist to us. And they exist because there's nothing else, right? You need to store text in a place, and this is the place that the text gets stored. But But then we build our editors around the files rather than around the languages. Various languages have, you can only have one class in a file, or you can have multiple classes in a file. And it's like, if you can have multiple classes, why do we have a file? Well, because we have to, because we write code on Unix. But it doesn't really bring anything to the table.
Yeah, there are a lot of like semantics that are just like baked into this structure, and it adds, naming a file and where the file lives in the folder structure is like communicating this thing, and it's like a part of the pattern of shaping your code. I've been really excited by languages like Unison Web, which is like all your code's in a database, and instead of like functions don't have names, they have these globally unique identifiers that are like what their actual identity are, and you can apply a label to it and just see the label, and if you want to rename it, you can rename it, but like that's a non-destructive operation to the actual code. And stuff like that is just incredibly exciting. And I think Dart sort of like plays into that model as well, of like, being less tightly coupled to this base structure.
Yeah, I mean, same sort of idea. The code is stored in a database. It's an AST. Functions are versioned. Kind of. I think that we agree on a lot of things.
So Dark is a pretty expansive project. It's its own language. So what are some of the challenges you've faced building this completely new language?
A lot of the advantage of Dart comes from the fact that we own the whole thing, right? So we own the editor, we own the database, we own the infrastructure, we own the language. And that means that the language needs to be designed for these things. So a very obvious one is the language has to take into account the existence of feature flags, whereas in in a normal language, you would use like the launch Darkly SDK, and there'd be an if statement or something like that. But our language needs semantics for what is a feature flag and how does it differ from an if statement. Then we need something like partials. So a partial is what you get when you backspace over a function name until you have filled in a new function name, right? So it's this sort of like the intermediate state, and that needs semantics as well. And then the semantics of that need to intersect with the semantics of the feature flag. And there's a couple of things like that. There's 4 or 5 different things where there's a little bit of not exactly a complexity explosion, since we've managed to like shave each of the features a little bit, but sometimes they intersect, and then they intersect with the editor, and they intersect with like the SQL compiler, and so a lot of times there's like, there's this entirely new thing that we invented, and we invented it because it needs to run in to allow users have this deployless environment, but now we need to define the semantics for it in the SQL editor, or like what happens if someone tries to save this value to a database? What does that mean? So I think that's kind of like our probably our most interesting challenge. The other major thing is Dark is still a language under development, so we still want to change some of the language semantics, but we don't want to break anything that our users have done. So we need to migrate our users from old versions of the things to new versions of the things, and we need to figure out a way that the semantics either don't change, or that we can validate that they don't change for any particular users, or we can give them some way to just like not be affected. And that's a little bit tough.
Cool. So Dark has like kind of like automatic migrations built in for old language features to new features?
Well, if they didn't, we would have to keep all the old language features forever. And then we would have to, every time we built another language feature, that's another thing for it to understand. Every time we build a new editor, it's like, what happens if the person uses version 1 of records, which were, invented 4 years ago, and now everyone's on version 3. And what happens if they switch to version 2 from version 1, but they didn't switch to version 2? Yeah, there's just, it becomes a mess. And it's similar with functions. Like, we like to delete old code. We want to move people from old versions to new versions, remove deprecated things from documentation. So we built deprecation into the language. We built it into the standard library. The most obvious thing there is that if you've never used a function, we will only show you the latest version of it. So, for example, HTTP client is now at version 5. We won't show you version 1 to 4 or 0 to 4 if you never added it. But we would also like to remove version 0, version 1, version 2. And so we would like to migrate you to the new versions, and we'd like to know that it's safe. So in a sense, part of what Dark takes on board, part of the complexity burden that gets taken on by Dark, the product, is migrating users from old versions to new versions. And that's not always going to be easy.
Considering the language and sort of the integrated language features, how much of the developer experience of Dark really is from the design of the language itself? And I mean, what other programming languages might you compare it to?
So Dark was very much designed with sort of developer experience in mind. We wanted to keep it really simple. We wanted to avoid a lot of the things that we felt were kind of wrong directions for the industry. So, for example, inheritance. I don't think inheritance was a good direction for the industry to go. Kind of moving away from it as an industry. Certainly, languages that are created today don't have the sort of in-depth inheritance that C++ and Java had. The other thing I really like is immutability. I've been coding in immutable languages for over 10 years now. It's phenomenal. Literally every language I've used in the last decade has been immutable, except when I have to write JavaScript. So Dark is a statically typed functional language. It is very similar to Elm, has some similarities to Rust. It's similar a little bit to Haskell, OCaml, F#, Rescript. These are a lot of these languages are very similar. Has some types, it's immutable. And that's very much designed because you can understand programs a lot better if they're immutable.
So does Dart come with any type of type safety? Like with the whole shift in code organization, where do I store a utils file? Is it me just talk serverless functions talking back and forth to each other? How does that all work?
So I'll address your first question. So type safety. Dark is designed to be a statically typed functional language. However, we don't actually have a type checker, and we put a lot of the type checking into the runtime, which has problems. So Dark will be gaining a type checker in the future, and that will be part of the editor. So, in the same way that type checking is done at the start of a compile, similar, every time you press a character, there will be a type check done, and it will be designed around this kind of language that could be partially written, sort of thing. And there's a lot of advantages that right now, if you want something to type check, you have to get this stuff in front of the type checking. You can't do sort of this partial type checking. And there's a couple of languages in academia that have this concept called type tools. Hazel and there's another couple that are like it. Type checking will be built in.
So from what I understand of Dark, you're just kind of declaring oh, here's my get request and how that works. Sharing code between that, if I want to have just a general utility function that I use in two routes, is that other route represented as, or is that utility represented as a route, or can I just share the code in some way?
It's just functions. So Dark is designed monorepos are. Everyone wants a monorepo. Monorepos are much better than anything else than microservices. But the reason that people move away from monorepos have nothing to do with the fact that monorepos aren't great. They're the fact that they don't scale particularly well once you get to a certain size. And so people, carve it off into teams, or they carve it off into a particular function, or they carve off something that has a different deployment velocity or deployment frequency to something else, or whose tests, take much longer or, don't change very often. And none of those actually matter in Dark. All of those can be subsumed. So Dark is going to be a single monorepo for your entire company, your entire organization. And then we can carve things off into, use groups for different organizations, different divisions, different teams. There's no need for something to be like, put in another route. It's not serverless like Lambda is serverless. It's really just like, there are functions, there are types, they're shared across the thing, but they're only loaded for the things that need them to be loaded. So for a particular route, that route knows what it needs. And so the things are loaded for that.
So going back to something you talked about earlier, so you mentioned, feature flags being a built-in part of the language, and having this deployless sort of environment where you're putting things into production sort of immediately and trying to do that safely, with like the feature flagging systems. But at some level, you need to be able to validate your application. You need to be able to ensure that, the logic that you've implemented is what you expected it to be, or, whatever. So how does testing work, or validation in general work within the Dark ecosystem?
Dark has this idea of trace-driven development. So what that means is let's suppose you're building a client, building, a standards React client, let's say, right? You build a button, you press the button, that button then goes to the Dark server, right? And there's no endpoint for it, so it appears in the 404s, and you click a button, run the shortcuts. You now have an API route for that request that you just made. And you also have the data. And in fact, every time that any user makes a request against an endpoint, we store a trace of that data. So for testing, what we're probably going to do, a couple of things, but the first of them is we're going to take traces and turn them into tests. Right? These were the things that you typed yourself in your editor, or in your client. So there's a list of them. You can go through them. And over time, we will find ones that are interesting. We'll find ones that are broken. We'll, apply some funky machine learning to say this one is an important one to become a test. And we'll allow you convert them into tests. And because Dark is immutable, most tests are just going to be, here's an input, we expect this output. For the unimmutable things, like saving to a data store, our analysis framework, which is what we would use for testing, already has a built-in concept of what you would call mocking. So we would have the results stored as part of that trace, which is kind of the same as mocks built into it. So then once you've got that concept, right, you've got your inputs, you've got your mocks, you've got your outputs, and you've got types for the things that are coming in and the things that are going out, we'll add automatic fuzzing. So we'll suggest things that increase code coverage, suggest these paths that you haven't gone down before. So not done yet. And all these things exist in the real world, but people don't really use them because the overhead of them is so high. But I think that the overhead of them will be really low in Dark, and we'll be able to make them really sort of usable in people's workflows.
That's a super cool idea. Just having, like, you basically have snapshots of all the inputs that you could possibly want, and just being like, oh yeah, click a few boxes. Those are the tests that I want for this. That's a super powerful concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit tangentially of there's a Rails library out there called VCR, which is like, we'll record your inputs and outputs, and you can use those for testing. It's like, a lot of times in testing, the hardest thing is getting like semi-real data that like simulates what the production code would simulate. So that'd be super helpful.
Yeah. the other thing that's sort of related to that is you have an exception tracker in a language or in your infrastructure. Maybe it's connected to your logging / observability, whatever. But for the most part, there's something there that when an exception happens, it captures the stack trace. That rarely feeds back into your test cases, right? Some of them at some point had buttons that you could generate a unit test, but like obviously, unit tests are kind of custom for your framework and that sort of thing. But it should, every exception you have should turn into a unit test of some sort. And again, exception tracking is something that will be part of Dark. So obviously, that will feed back into testing and traces, and just having a small number of primitives. They will be the same primitives throughout the application.
It seems like a lot of things are built into Dark right now. One thing I read about that I don't think is quite implemented yet is a package manager. What are your guys' plans for a package manager, and what type of code do you think would be shared through a package manager?
Yeah, so the obvious one is functions will be most. Like really in Dark, everything is kind of a function. It's a functional language. There's not really very many other constructs in it. The types are the other one that your functions are going to have types. So you're going to have some custom types. Those types are going to have to be shared as well. And all of those are going to be versioned separately. So there's not going to be versions of a package. There's going to be versions of a function and versions of a type. So you might even have types or you might even have functions that use two or that take parameters of two different versions of the same type. Perhaps that's something that to help people migrate from the old version of the package to the new version of the package or something like that. So that's an obvious one. The other obvious one is kind of templates. So people. If you're building, let's say, a user package, you're going to want some templates for a HTML page, for a sign-up form, a password reset form, maybe some, what do you call them? Third-party sign-in, single sign-on, or social media sign-ons or whatever. You're going to need some forms for that. So those would sort of be put in the same packaging thing. The ones that get a little less traditional, refactoring tools are going to be part of the package manager. So refactoring tools are going to be written in Dark. You're going to be able to use them in the editor, and then you're going to be able to put them into a package. And so we want people to distribute packages that have refactoring tools in them. And maybe these are people have in essence, DSLs, domain-specific languages, often that they ship, and there are perhaps some static checks that you can do on your types because it's not possible to have certain things or whatever. Those are things that are going to be distributed as part of it as well.
Yeah, it's really awesome. It seems like packages are like similarly related functionalities to groups almost, and that given that all of this is integrated, that the concepts have a lot of overlap,
Right. Yeah. So down the road, I want people to distribute whole applications in Dark. So I want, I think that Dark is a good place to build your entire company's infrastructure in. One of the reasons that I started Dark was I was using this application tracking system, and I can't remember what it was called, Recruiter Box, I think. And it was, it had some problems, so we were going to switch to Lever, and then Lever had some other problems as well. And we wanted to kind of, the concepts, the workflow of this actually isn't that complicated. We wanted to use an API. We wanted to have access to all the things that were happening in the API, and we wanted to pipe them into some custom things, some emails, some Slack channels, and they just didn't have integrations for this. And kind of contemplated should we build this ourselves? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. And I realized that we're now at this point where writing anything yourselves, writing your own product that you could buy instead is almost always a bad choice because the overhead of writing code is so high. The overhead of like running service and maintaining things is so high. And so I felt that if we reduced that complexity enough, that people would actually be able to write tools themselves again. And we'd be able to write our own applicant tracking system. And perhaps the people in the talent side of the company, the recruiting side of the company, would be able to, add their own custom notifications, add their own custom toolings, add their own custom workflows on top of that to represent what they actually do day to day. And perhaps it would be something where, if the team wants a weekly report about what's coming in, you don't just get what the tool has built in, you get to actually build your own stuff in it. So I imagine that at some point in the future, someone will build, an applicant tracking system in Dark, and they will put that in the package manager, and your company will be able to install that, will be able to contribute back to it, will be able to, build your own custom workflows on top of it. Yeah.
And that wraps it up for tooltips this week. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Paul. This was a super interesting conversation about a potential future for programming, and I hope...
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I wish you guys the best and hope for your success.
Thank you.
Yeah, Paul, awesome as always. Really, really excited to see Dark's future. It's such a cool project and such a huge inspiration. So yeah, just keep doing good work. It's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Dark is open to contributors and for people to try it. Darkmind.com. We'd love people to give it a go.
Well, that's it for this week's free portion of the episode. If you want to listen to the full conversation, head over to our Patreon and become a member. For just $5 a month, you can help support the show and help us get to our goal of delivering content weekly. Thanks for listening.